Hello, everybody. Welcome to Quick Step for this week. I am your host, Tristan of Step Back. So I got what I could only describe as a huge buttload of requests to talk about the yellow jacket movement that's going on in France. And I guess because I can read French, that seems like an apropos thing for me to discuss. And I want to talk a little bit about it because it hits on a whole bunch of very interesting issues, discussions of class, discussions of climate change, and even discussions about what is the right way to make the kind of social changes that we want to make in the world. So let's start with what is going on. Why are people wearing yellow jackets and protesting? Well, it all goes back to the election of Emmanuel Macron a couple years ago. For anyone who remembers, Emmanuel Macron is the president of France, and how to describe him? During the election, French elections sort of have this two-round process in which the first round of elections are open wide for all sorts of people to run for president, and then the top two winners of that election face off against each other for a second round, and then whoever wins that becomes the actual president. Now, because France is a part of hell world like the rest of us, the French either rallied behind Emmanuel Macron, who was a out-and-out centrist neoliberal, who sort of built a alliance of scared left and right-wing people, and sort of abandoned any hope of the socialists or anybody else getting into power. And who were they all afraid of? Well, that was, of course, Marine Le Pen, who was his opponent for the presidency in the second round, who is basically a fascist. No, not even basically. She is a fascist. She's a far-right political leader, and her father was a literal Holocaust denier, and she has on several occasions said praising things about the Nazis and Holocaust denial, although she's totally taken it back now. Anyways, the centrists thought that Emmanuel Macron was an amazing person and thought that he would do great things as president, just like when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada, who's also a centrist. And they are a lot alike. They got a lot of the sort of faux progressive liberal centrist attention, but then once they actually went to power, they started doing the exact things that caused people like Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump to become prominent figures in the first place. The big things that Macron has done since he became president is push through radical reforms for labor that the conservatives in France had been dreaming about for years. So in France, labor is pretty powerful, and Emmanuel Macron started passing sweeping legislation to roll back labor rights in France, and has been giving the pinch to the working class ever since he came to power. Now, France is, like many other countries, trying to hit a target for climate change goals, trying to make sure that they get within their Paris Agreement agreed amount of carbon dioxide output. And one of the things that Macron is trying to do is put in a tax on diesel fuel in order to reduce consumption in order to hit that goal. But of course, a tax like this is going to pinch the working class way harder than, say, rich people. And so you have a growing protest movement trying to repeal the taxes that have been imposed on diesel. And so Emmanuel Macron is going to try to make the argument, I think, that climate change targets need to be hit. It's going to hurt, but we need to put in these taxes or else it's not going to happen. We'll talk a little bit about the effectiveness of taxing fuel as a way to solve our climate change issues. I've talked to a few people who know way more than me, and I've gotten some comments. Essentially, what it boils down to is that a couple things. Someone more climate change savvy than me told me that these sorts of taxes on fuel tend not to get us to these targets anyway. The things that we're going to need to do in order to address the immediate crisis of climate change will be to have massive infrastructure changes to the way the economy functions at its deepest root. Essentially, that capitalism is inherently incompatible with sustained living ecosystem on this planet. And after I talked to Mexi, who definitely would say that, by the way, you should subscribe to Mexi, she's awesome, that neoliberal environmentalism is inherently contradictory because they will use their screw the poor ideology and try to use that as a sort of blanket in order to push a regressive agenda, which then will make the environmentalist movement undesirable by the working class, who are already basically being crushed to the bone by the wealthy. And even those who do want to save the planet will be against this raising of taxes on fuel because, as I said, the issues of climate change are not going to be fixed with things like taxes. They're going to have to be fixed with massive restructuring of the base essentials of the world economy. And we need to undo the way that we produce energy, the way we travel, even the way that we produce and consume food. It's going to be big, and we don't have a lot of time, so it's pressing. There's gonna be some tough times ahead. Anyways, to get back to the issue of the Yellow Jacket movement, wrapping up a neoliberal regressive agenda under the auspices of vague appeals to good causes like climate change or any sort of environmental justice, social justice reform is pretty common in the playbook of the neoliberal center-right centrist agenda. Completely unrelated, but here's an action figure of Bernie Sanders. I don't know why I decided to say that right this moment. We're talking about using social justice movements in order to shame somebody who might have a better social justice record than, say, a different candidate, but then also be pushing a hard right neoliberal agenda. And I'd actually want to give kudos for sort of the genius of the Yellow Jacket movement. It's perfect for what we're talking about today. It's iconic. They're cheap to get. They're simple to find. They're bright yellow, so whenever pictures of the protest happen, whether violent or non-violent, you see the jackets, you see them right there, front and center. So there's no being coy about who is and isn't part of this protest. And also, it's now become iconic of the movement. One of the other big things is that these yellow jackets, these high visibility jackets, are commonly worn by working class people in France. So they have a great branding expert definitely there in the French Yellow Jacket protests. And already the centrist media is trying to downplay these protests, talk about them as a violent, rowdy crowd. One of the biggest things that, if you look at some of the articles stateside, you'll notice that the centrist media has covered this in a way that feels very much like when Tucker Carlson got protested, where they have extreme love and desire to protect and honor the integrity of private property. If you remember, we should all have a moment for Tucker Carlson's unfortunately violated door. And so a lot of the centrist media talking about France, talking about the violence, but also talking about emphasizing the damage that has been done, especially to historic monuments. There's been some defacement of a statue on the Arc de Triomphe, which is, I would say, unfortunate, but is one part of a bigger story, and the whole squeezing the working class of every last bit of economic power they have doesn't seem to make it to the front of the story. At least not as much as pictures of damaged statues do. But yeah, it's been a real trip to see what happened, and all I can think of, and this happens as a Canadian who also lives with a French-speaking province, is how do we get that French level of involvement? How do you get a yellow vest movement so quickly in France? Well, first of all, I do think that it seems that in France there is a greater recognition of class consciousness. The French working class seem to realize that they are part of a group of people who have economic interests in direct opposition to the ruling class of the country. And there's nothing really reconcilable about the two options. For more discussion on that, I would probably recommend this video by PhilosophyTube. Pretty good discussion, and done like a guided meditation, which is kind of neat. And I also think that one of the things that makes it successful, and some of the reasons why I think groups like Occupy Wall Street were so powerful and grew so fast, or things like the Red Square movement in Quebec, which was a protest against the raising of tuitions at universities, is because they rallied around causes. All right, my fellow leftists, you're probably going to have to sit down and maybe take a cup of tea over this one, but maybe we should focus more of our social movements and political activism around issues that we can make relatable and important to people in their everyday lives now. Maybe the reason why leftist movements have been historically so anemic is not just because of the infighting that is rampant in leftist movements, but also the propaganda by the ruling elites. But maybe there's a third thing, which is we browbeat the people who try to enter these movements because they haven't read thousands of books by Eastern European philosophers that nobody cares about, that lived in a time that is completely unapplicable to today's day and age, sell leftist ideas as what they are, which are things that are practical, shown to work, and make everybody's lives better. So instead of saying that you can't be a true leftist unless you truly understand the fetishization of currency, maybe we should be talking about getting people who don't have food, or getting people who don't have homes or are paying like over half their income to their rent, places they can live and feel secure in living. Maybe getting unemployed or underemployed people jobs. These are the kinds of things that people care about, and these are the things that we should rally behind. And there's a lot of criticism because there have been people from unsavory parts of the political spectrum joining the Yellow Jacket movement, but they are all rallying around one issue, which is the pinch on the working class of the price of fuel. Something that afflicts anybody who drives any sort of vehicle, which is a lot of working class people, especially blue-collar workers. And in my mind, this is in violation of a lot of leftist circles who seem to like to focus on either LARPing, that they're going to have the next Russian Revolution and somehow defeat all of the armored personnel carriers, armed drones, and Hellfire missiles and somehow take over the government, and then also, while doing that, somehow not just put another authoritarian dictatorship, or just trying to split up into smaller and smaller leftist groups because people aren't sufficiently radical for your desires. I said in a stream earlier this week that if you go to any given large city and look for leftist anarchisty type groups, you're almost always going to find two because they've broken up over some doctrinal disagreement and they will not work with each other. Meanwhile, the conservatives and the Nazis are working just fine hand in hand with each other and getting more and more power as every day goes on. It's also a wonderful cheer for direct action. The fact that they weren't just like gonna wait until 2024 when Emmanuel Macron comes up for re-election. They decided to, actually get involved and disrupt the system in order to force the issue, resulted in success. Macron actually announced that he's going to repeal or at least halt the tax indefinitely until they can figure out another solution. And if you watched my AIDS video earlier this week, you'll know that direct action usually is a much more effective and permanent solution than, say, just voting for the right person every handful of years. I know it was a bit scatterbrained, but I just wanted to get out a few thoughts about this whole movement. I think it's been really interesting to watch and is very inspirational about how we as people can do the act of making the world a better place. I want to thank all of the climate change people and Marxism people who were way smarter than me on these things, who I was able to talk to and get information, including Mexi, who, as I said, subscribe, please. There's also going to be a meetup in Toronto this weekend with me and Mexi and Thoughtslime. There's more information in the comments. You should check it out. And yeah, watch my AIDS video. I worked really hard on it, and I think that it needs more attention than it's gotten. But that's just my opinion. Anyways, take care, everybody. See you next week.